My mother was in the late stages of stomach cancer, and her biggest wish before she died was to see me marry Alexander. After much pleading, he finally agreed to marry me. However, on the day of the wedding, he suddenly disappeared. That night, my mother passed away with regrets, leaving me behind. The next day, his childhood friend, Olivia, posted a photo of them together on social media, with the caption, "Forced love will never bring happiness. In his heart, I am the one and only." Relatives and friends tried to comfort me. I wiped away my tears and replied, "Congratulations, green tea paired with a dog, may it last forever." I didn't cry or make a scene. I silently took care of my mother's affairs alone. Actually, I wasn't surprised at all that Alexander abandoned me for Olivia. We had been together for 5 years, but Olivia could always take him away with just a phone call. I didn't even care about the reason this time. I was done questioning it. After handling my mother's matters, I went back home. Alexander wasn't there, and I was glad I didn't have to see him. Just as I was about to leave with my packed suitcase, I saw Olivia walking in with Alexander. He froze when he saw me, then glanced at the suitcase in my hand, his brow furrowing instinctively. "Isabella, what are you making a scene about now?" he asked in a tone that made it seem as though I was the unreasonable one. Olivia smiled innocently at me but then clung possessively to Alexander, as if marking her territory. "Sorry, Isabella, my hand got hurt that day, and Alexander came to take care of me." "I didn't know that day was your wedding." I looked at her, and there was a tiny band-aid on her left index finger. So, this was the reason Alexander had abandoned me and skipped the wedding? I suddenly felt ridiculous. In his heart, my mother and I weren't even as important as Olivia's little finger. "Alexander, let's break up." Since the moment my mother died in my arms, all my love for him had disappeared. But Alexander thought I was jealous of Olivia. "Isabella, can you be a little more sensible? The wedding can happen any time, but Olivia was hurt, and I couldn't just ignore her. Can you be more sensible?" This was the phrase Alexander had said to me the most. But what does it mean to be sensible? Because Alexander said Olivia was his sister, I allowed a third person to be part of our relationship. I allowed him to carry medicine for Olivia, allowed him to rush to another woman when I needed him most, and allowed her to take over his heart. But my sensibility only brought more hurt from them, and I had had enough of it. I looked at Alexander coldly. "Do whatever you want. I won't interfere with you anymore." After saying that, I walked past him with my suitcase. Alexander finally realized something was wrong and grabbed me. "Is something wrong with what happened that day? I can go explain to your mother." I suddenly felt how absurd everything was. After so many days, if he had cared a little more about me, if he had asked how I was, he wouldn't be saying such foolish things. I wrenched his hand away. No need. I had always been careful and gentle in front of Alexander, trying to please him. But now, I was colder than I had ever been. Alexander stood there, stunned, watching my retreating figure. After a moment, he was about to follow me, but Olivia held him back. "Alexander, it's really not your fault. If it wasn't for her mother faking illness and emotionally blackmailing you, you wouldn't have been forced to marry her." My mind went blank. By the time I reacted, my hand had already slapped Olivia's face. Alexander, who had still felt some guilt toward me, instantly changed his expression. He instinctively shielded Olivia behind him, his eyes icy. "Isabella, what are you doing?" I glared at Olivia. "You better watch your mouth." Olivia looked wronged. "Did I say anything wrong? If it weren't for your mother faking illness to morally blackmail Alexander, how would he have been forced to marry you?" I turned to look at Alexander. "Is that what you believe too?" He didn't answer, but I could already see the answer in his eyes. 6 months ago, my mother was diagnosed with late-stage stomach cancer. Knowing her time was running out, her biggest wish before she passed away was to see me marry the man I loved, to have a good ending. To fulfill her wish, I begged Alexander desperately, even kneeling to him, to get this wedding. But he thought my mother was pretending to be ill to pressure him into marrying me. Maybe he had always looked down on me from the start. He was the chosen one, the heir of the Alexander family. I had fallen for him at first sight in college and shamelessly pursued him for 4 years. Alexander liked obedient women, so I complied with his every whim, let him take whatever he wanted. But after meeting Olivia, I realized that he had this gentle side, one that he never showed me. Olivia can act spoiled and playful in front of him, holding his hand and hugging him. She does everything I want to do but don't dare. Once, I tried to act spoiled like Olivia and he coldly pushed me away, saying, "Isabella, you really don't suit this, you know?" It felt like being slapped in public, and I awkwardly watched his back as he walked away. After that, I never tried to act spoiled again. He has never once taken my hand voluntarily. With him, I am always one step behind, only Olivia can walk side by side with him. He never rejects her touch. Being with him, I have nothing but the title of girlfriend. To outsiders, it's clear that he and Olivia are a couple. He takes her out in public, introduces her to everyone. If it weren't for my mother's illness and my repeated pleading, there never would have been that laughable wedding. I looked at Alexander with disappointment. This is the man I've loved for almost 10 years. Now, I'm starting to wonder what I ever saw in him. Olivia, however, added fuel to the fire. "Brother Alexander, look. Is my face swollen? How could she be so ill-mannered? My face hurts so much." Alexander's attention immediately turned to her. I slapped her with all my strength, leaving clear finger marks on her face. Alexander's expression turned dark. "Isabella, apologize." "What if I don't?" I lifted my head, my face full of defiance. Alexander forced down his anger. "Isabella, don't make me angry." To be honest, I've always been afraid of Alexander. Every time he put on a stern face, even without saying a word, I would instinctively soften and apologize. That was when I still cared about him. But now, I don't care anymore. Yet Olivia wasn't satisfied. "Brother Alexander, I don't want her apology. If she dares to hit me, I want her to pay it back tenfold." Hearing this, Alexander glanced at me, trying to make me back down. But I remained unyielding. My attitude enraged him, and he deliberately decided to teach me a lesson. With a glance, he signaled 2 bodyguards who appeared out of nowhere to restrain me. I had no strength to struggle, nor did I care to. Olivia walked proudly in front of me and raised her hand, slapping me several times across the face. Blood started to trickle from the corner of my mouth. I said nothing, sitting helplessly on the floor, disheveled. Alexander looked down at me. "This is what you owe Olivia. Apologize to her, and I'll pretend nothing happened." I suddenly laughed. "Dream on." Alexander narrowed his eyes. "Isabella, as long as you behave, I can give you whatever you want, including marriage. Have you thought it through?" When I wanted it, he wouldn't give it to me. Now that I didn't want it anymore, he tried to coerce and bribe me into compromise. Enduring the pain on my face, I coldly spoke. "Alexander, I told you we've broken up. I will not marry you." Perhaps because I had shown so much love for him before, Alexander didn't believe I would leave him, especially since he had promised me the marriage I had longed for. He sneered. "What? Don't you want to fulfill your mother's dying wish?" From his words, I could detect a hint of disdain. But before I could speak, Olivia seized the opportunity. "Brother Alexander, I told you she's lying. If her mother was really dying, why would she have this attitude? Don't fall for her act." I couldn't take it anymore. "Shut up, you have no right to talk about my mom." My repeated defiance completely angered Alexander. "I see you won't cry until you see the coffin." Alexander sneered and made a phone call to his assistant, ensuring that I could hear everything by putting it on speaker. "Max, cancel the wedding arrangements." The wedding was with the best wedding planning company in the country. "And cancel Isabella's mother's surgery." Alexander thought he could threaten me, and as he spoke, his eyes never left mine. I just looked at him, showing no reaction at all. Max hesitated for a moment before speaking up. "President Alexander, Miss Isabella's mother passed away 3 days ago, on the day of your wedding." "What? How is that possible?" Alexander's whole body shook. He looked at me in disbelief, then became even more furious and asked, "Why didn't you tell me about such a big matter sooner?" His assistant, afraid of getting blamed, hurriedly explained, "President Alexander, you were the one who told us not to report Miss Isabella's matters to you." I heard that last sentence loud and clear. Actually, I wasn't surprised. To Alexander, aside from Olivia, my life or death, my happiness or sorrow, doesn't matter at all. After hanging up the phone, Alexander staggered toward me. "Isabella, it's not like that. I didn't know your mother, you were fine when we last met. I didn't know she was so ill. The last time Alexander saw my mother was 3 months ago. I begged him for a long time before he finally agreed to meet my mother. By then, the cancer had spread throughout her body, but she still forced herself to prepare a big meal to entertain Alexander. At first, everything was fine. But within 5 minutes of sitting down, he took a phone call and then just left us, never coming back. I knew that phone call was from Olivia. My mother, heartbroken for me, didn't say anything on the surface, but that night, she secretly cried under the covers. That was when I first thought about breaking up with Alexander. But when the words were on the tip of my tongue, looking at his face, I just couldn't bring myself to do it, so I held back once again. I knew my mother didn't like Alexander, but because I liked him, she didn't want to make me unhappy, so she kept quiet. She endured for 3 more months, just wanting to see me marry him and have a family of my own. But that day, Alexander didn't come. My mother and I waited from dawn until night, and in the end, my mother collapsed in my arms and never woke up. I pushed Alexander away. "It doesn't matter anymore." Seeing my indifferent expression, Alexander finally panicked. He had a strong premonition that he was about to lose me. "Isabella, believe me, I really didn't mean to miss that day. If you want to get married, I'll have my assistant arrange everything. We can go to get the marriage license tomorrow, okay?" I said the same thing again, "No need." Alexander pleaded, "Isabella, why are you so stubborn?" Yes. If I weren't so stubborn, how could I have loved him for 9 years, loved him so much that I was willing to give up my self-respect? I even endured him repeatedly hurting me and abandoning me for Olivia. These 9 years have been exhausting. I no longer have the strength to keep entangling with him. In the end, I left the apartment where I had lived with Alexander for 2 years, dragging my wounded body away. This time, he didn't chase after me. Before living with Alexander, I had spent all my savings to buy a 2-bedroom apartment for my mother. After my father passed away, I had always lived with my mother. Now that she had left me, I felt like the whole world had abandoned me. I took a half-month leave from work and completely cut myself off from the outside world. Every day, I just ate and slept at home. Alexander called me many times, but I didn't answer any of them. Alexander's assistant also contacted me, saying that Alexander had found the best cemetery in the city and wanted me to move my mother's grave there. I refused. My mother had already been laid to rest, why disturb her again? But Alexander didn't give up. One day, I received a large package, and when I opened it, I found a wedding dress. There was also a letter written by Alexander himself. I didn't open it, but returned the package as it was. I knew that whether it was the cemetery or the wedding dress, they were Alexander's way of trying to make amends, to win me back, but I no longer cared. I spent the next half-month in a haze. Finally, I returned to work. The concern from my colleagues and bosses was comforting, it reminded me that I wasn't alone. But just before the end of the workday, I received a call from an unknown number. After hesitating for a few seconds, I answered it. The familiar voice came through, "Isabella." I didn't speak. Alexander cautiously began, "Isabella, I know you're still angry with me. What happened before was my fault. I apologize. Tomorrow, the Alexander family is holding a banquet. I'll send someone to pick you up. At the banquet, I'll announce to everyone that you're my future wife. I'll give you a grand wedding. I know I've wronged you in the past, but I promise you, I'll take care of you from now on." If I had heard these words before, even a month ago, I would have been ecstatic, thinking I had finally warmed up his icy heart. But now, I only found it laughable. Why did he only want to cherish me after losing me? Why did he only think of being good to me now? What a scoundrel. Alexander, I won't go. But Alexander insisted, no. Isabella, I will wait for you. Whether you come or not, I will declare to the world that you are mine, Alexander's woman. I ignored him and hung up the phone. But the next day, I still went. Our company has a partnership with the Alexander family, so of course, I received an invitation. Normally, another colleague would accompany Ethan to such events. But because of my situation, the colleague who was supposed to accompany Ethan had been working overtime for a whole month. She finally had a day off, and I didn't want to bother her again, nor did I want to delay work because of personal matters. I thought I could just avoid him when the time came. However, as soon as I reached the door, I saw Alexander standing outside the venue, looking around. When he saw me, his eyes lit up. Isabella, I knew you would come. I stepped back with a blank expression. Alexander, I'm here to work today. Alexander clearly didn't believe me. He reached out to grab me, but I dodged. Ethan's gaze shifted between the two of us for a moment. President Alexander, do you know Isabella? Alexander nodded. She's my fiancé. Ethan raised an eyebrow. I felt a bit annoyed. Alexander, how many times do I have to tell you? We've broken up. Alexander didn't get angry. Isabella, I know you're just saying that out of anger. I couldn't be bothered to argue with him. Fortunately, Alexander didn't stay long. After a while, his assistant called him away. I was left alone, staring at Ethan. The people at the company knew I had a boyfriend, but no one knew he was the CEO of the Alexander family. I felt a little embarrassed, not sure how to explain to Ethan. Luckily, Ethan wasn't a gossiping type. He just patted me on the back and didn't say anything. I wasn't surprised when I saw Olivia at the banquet. At events like this, Olivia always appeared as Alexander's companion. When Olivia saw me, she frowned. Isabella, what are you doing here? I calmly replied, working. Like Alexander, Olivia didn't believe me. Isabella, I advise you to leave brother Alexander alone. He's mine. Only I will be the future lady of the Alexander family. I didn't understand. I had already made it clear that I had broken up with Alexander. Why was she still saying all this to me? I've already broken up with Alexander. As for whether you can become the future lady of the Alexander family, that's up to your own ability. I said it in a flat tone. Olivia, however, took it as mocking. She snorted coldly. Don't get too proud. Brother Alexander is just pitying you. He'll eventually realize that I'm the one most suited for him. Do you really think brother Alexander loves you? That day, I just pretended to scratch my hand, and he immediately dropped everything to take care of me, leaving you and your mother behind. In his heart, I'm the most important. I didn't need her to tell me that. I already knew. Besides, I was here to work today, and I had no intention of arguing with her. Olivia, seeing that I remained indifferent despite all her words, like a punch hitting cotton, became quite furious. Suddenly, she gave me a strange smile. Isabella, today I'll show you that, in brother Alexander's heart, you mean nothing. With that, she pressed her hand to her chest and, without warning, fell backward. As if on cue, a pair of large hands appeared behind her and caught her firmly. It was the same old trick. I was already tired of it. But Olivia had gotten addicted to playing the victim. She weakly leaned into Alexander's arms. Brother Alexander, my chest hurts so much. I was just trying to comfort Isabella, who recently lost her mother, but she didn't appreciate it. She blames me for taking you away from her. Seeing her look pale, Alexander hurriedly pulled out a bottle of pills from his pocket, poured out a few, and shoved them into her mouth. Because Olivia's health wasn't good, Alexander always carried her regular medication with him. When he looked at me again, there was a trace of annoyance in his eyes. Isabella, I've already said I will announce to everyone that you're my future wife. What more do you want? Olivia is just a sick person. Why do you have to argue with her over everything? Sick person? She seemed perfectly fine when she was in front of me. Only Alexander, blind and oblivious, couldn't see through her act. I hadn't planned on doing anything to Olivia, but since she kept provoking me, she shouldn't blame me for what happened next. I took out my phone and waved it playfully in front of her. Having dealt with her for so many years and been tricked multiple times, I naturally learned to be cautious. The moment she came close to me, I secretly started recording. As expected, she began her act again. I turned the volume up to the maximum, ensuring that everyone in the room could hear. When I heard Olivia say, "That day I just pretended to scratch my hand," and, in Alexander's heart, "You mean nothing," Alexander's expression suddenly became very interesting. Olivia panicked and lunged at me, trying to grab my phone. "Isabella, how dare you set me up?" I smiled. I learned from the best. The guests around us gathered, their gazes filled with amusement as they watched her like she was a clown. Olivia trembled with anger but couldn't do anything about it. After a moment, Alexander seemed to realize what was happening, and his eyes were filled with guilt and shock as he looked at me. "It's not like this," Olivia began to explain. "Brother Alexander, you have to listen to me. I love you so much. You promised my parents you would take care of me for life. How can you break your promise? How can you leave me and be with another woman?" Alexander finally looked at her, his gaze no longer filled with the usual gentleness and care, but instead with deep disappointment and anger. "Olivia, I treated you like a sister. My wife will only be Isabella." Olivia was stunned by his declaration. She shook her head repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. "No. Brother Alexander, you can't do this to me. You promised my parents you would take care of me. If you abandon me, I won't be able to live." Olivia sobbed like a delicate flower in the rain. Even though Alexander must have been furious, when he saw her in this state, a trace of reluctance flashed in his eyes. For over 10 years, she had used this tactic, pretending to be sick and playing the victim to control Alexander. The Olivia family and the Alexander family had been close for generations. Olivia had heart issues when she was young and was frequently hospitalized. Alexander, being a few years older than her, had been asked by her parents to take care of her, and he had always remembered that promise. Later, when Olivia's parents died in an accident when she was 10, Alexander had kept his word, taking care of her all these years. After we got together, Olivia would always get sick for no reason, pulling him away from me. At first, I didn't think much of it and even felt sorry for her. But recently, I found out that her illness was all a lie. Seeing her cry and clutch her chest as if she were about to faint, looking all pitiful, I couldn't help but curl my lips into a smile. After fiddling with my phone, I played another video on full volume in front of everyone. At first, Olivia was confused, but when she saw the video clearly, her tears froze on her face. The woman in the video, with heavy makeup and smoking a cigarette, was none other than Olivia. She was surrounded by several male models, dancing and partying wildly in a bar. She looked anything but the fragile person with heart problems who couldn't handle any stress. That day, my colleague had dragged me to the bar, and when I saw the scene, I couldn't believe the woman was Olivia. But once I heard her unmistakable voice, I was sure it was her. I just hadn't found the right moment to tell Alexander. Alexander, being so arrogant, could never tolerate such repeated deception. When he looked at Olivia again, his eyes were as cold as ice, without any warmth. After a brief moment of guilt, Olivia still tried to argue, "No, that person isn't me. Brother Alexander, please believe me, it's Isabella. She's the one trying to frame me." Alexander had completely seen through her and coldly spat out, "Leave. Don't ever let me see you again." Alexander had never said anything so harsh to her before, and she stood there as if struck by lightning. What was supposed to be a grand banquet turned into a joke. Ignoring Alexander's apologetic gaze, I turned and walked out of the venue. From that day on, Olivia became the laughingstock of the entire social circle. I've caused quite a bit of trouble for the company lately, and made a scene at the Alexander family banquet. The next day, when Ethan called me to his office, I had already prepared myself to resign. To my surprise, the first thing Ethan said was, "Isabella, would you be willing to go abroad with me for a new opportunity?" I was stunned for a moment. I had heard that Ethan was being sent to manage the company's North American branch, but I never imagined the news was true. When he saw I didn't respond right away, Ethan continued, "If you agree, I'll promote you 3 levels, and your salary will be increased tenfold. I know this is sudden, so take some time to think about it." It was indeed sudden. But I couldn't think of any reason to refuse. There was nothing left here for me to hold on to. I looked at Ethan and said, "I don't need to think about it." "Ethan, I'll go with you." From then on, I focused on preparing for the move abroad. Alexander tried to contact me several times, but I ignored him. Ever since my mother's death, there was nothing left to say between us. On the day I left, I didn't tell anyone. By the time Alexander found out, I was already abroad. Before that, Alexander had always thought I was just throwing a tantrum, that I'd eventually come back to him. He had always been confident, and he had reason to be. But when he found out that I had sold my house, he finally panicked. He called me in a frenzy, "Isabella, why did you sell the house? You're not planning to come back, are you?" "Yes." When I agreed to go to North America with Ethan, I never planned on coming back. After I left, I heard that Alexander sent Olivia to Europe. Olivia cried and refused to board the plane, but he had his people force her on. No matter if it was all for show, none of it mattered to me anymore. What I didn't expect was for Alexander to chase me all the way abroad. The first time I saw him at the company, our eyes met. There was so much unspoken longing in his gaze. We had been together for 5 years, and to be honest, I never truly felt that Alexander loved me. Back then, he was with me because I was obedient and loved him so much. I calmly looked at him and said, "Alexander, don't come again. I don't want to see you anymore." But Alexander continued to fly over. Knowing I didn't want to see him, he would silently sit in the cafe across the street from the company. He didn't disturb me, sometimes sitting there the whole day. The entire company knew I had a crazy pursuer. Everyone was betting whether I would soften. But I didn't. Finally, after 4 years abroad, I agreed to meet him once. Alexander was as excited as a child. But the first thing I said was, "Alexander, don't come again." "Isabella, I have a boyfriend now." "What did you say?" Alexander's face was filled with shock and disbelief. "It's impossible. You must be lying to me." I smiled and shook my head. "I'm not lying. You know him too, it's Ethan." I never imagined that one day I would end up with Ethan. My relationship with Alexander had nearly drained me completely. At that time, my heart was dead, and I came to North America with him. Ethan was a great boss, mature, steady, and highly capable. Our relationship changed after a storm. I was trapped at home with a high fever of 40 degrees Celsius. He couldn't reach me and, risking the storm, rushed to my house. I had already passed out, and he took me to the hospital, staying with me for 2 days. When I woke up and saw him looking so disheveled and worried, I couldn't help but feel a warmth in my heart. Before that, I had only seen him as a boss, never thinking of him in any other way. After that day, we grew closer, and eventually, we naturally became a couple. I admit that being with Ethan was comfortable and reassuring, something Alexander had never given me. Alexander's eyes were bloodshot as he stared at me, trying to find a trace of lying in my gaze. But he found nothing. At that moment, it was as if his beliefs collapsed in an instant. He stared at me for a long time, his eyes red. I thought he would say something, but he just silently turned and left. After that day, I never saw him again. I only heard that after returning to China, Alexander fell seriously ill and became even colder and more ruthless in his actions than before. 2 years later, Ethan and I got married. The wedding was arranged by Ethan, simple yet romantic. On that day, I received a message from afar, "Isabella, I will wait for you forever." Alexander didn't attend our wedding, but he sent a gift of 8.88 million. After the wedding, I took Ethan to visit my mother's grave. To my surprise, we saw Alexander there, looking much thinner than before. Ethan thoughtfully gave us some space. Ever since I arrived, Alexander had been staring at me, his eyes reddening when he saw me. He forced a smile and said, "Isabella, have you been well these past years?" I smiled and replied, "I've been good." For a moment, we just stared at each other in silence. After a long pause, I couldn't help but sigh and say, "Alexander, I truly hope you can be happy, from the bottom of my heart." 6 years had passed, and all the resentment I once held had faded with time. Now, seeing him felt like seeing an old friend, calm and filled with mixed emotions. Alexander didn't expect to hear those words from me. He smiled, but his smile was bittersweet. "Isabella, I'd rather you kept hating me. At least that would mean you still care about me." I was stunned for a moment. After that, Alexander didn't say anything more and turned away, leaving with a sense of loneliness. It wasn't until Alexander had left that Ethan came over to my side and tightly took my hand. Soon, I put Alexander behind me, holding Ethan's hand as I looked at my mother's grave. "Mom, I will be happy. You can finally rest easy." Bonus, Alexander's perspective. It wasn't until I lost Isabella that I realized how important she was to me. I admit, when we first got together, it was because she was obedient and didn't cause me any trouble. Being with her was comfortable. But I didn't know, she was never truly happy by my side. She suffered a lot. I always treated Olivia like a little sister. She was my responsibility, and I had promised her parents that I would take care of her. At that time, I arrogantly thought Isabella would never leave me. Between her and Olivia, I always unconsciously leaned toward Olivia. It wasn't until she left that I realized just how wrong I was. Afterwards, I secretly went to see Isabella. That man treated her very well. He would carry her home when she was tired, and every time he picked her up, he would bring her a jacket to keep her warm. Whenever they were together, his left hand was never empty. It was at that moment that I realized, I had never once held her hand. I don't even remember the last time she smiled like that when she was with me. So, I really treated her badly, didn't I? I regret it, but she doesn't want me anymore.